Welcome to Off the Record News. I'm your host, Diana Longry. Thank you for tuning in. Off the Record News is brought to you weekly from the SPNN studios in St. Paul. Now, tonight we are going to be giving you a report on the preliminary discussions about property taxes in Ramsey County and the city of St. Paul. Near the end of the program, we will also include some of the presentation that was given to the St. Paul City Council by Police Chief Axtell about his department, and we hopefully will get to the clip where there was an outburst from the audience of somebody asking about where's the money going. So anyway, we're going to get started right away with our program. Now, to help me with this evening's report is Mr. Greg Copeland, a longtime resident of St. Paul and a watchdog in St. Paul, watching how they spend the dollars, watching the legislation that's being enacted by the City Council, and he's got a few things that he would like to report on as well with regard to the property tax report we have this evening. So, Mr. Copeland, thank you for being here.
It's a pleasure always to be with you, Diana.
Now, we're going to get started right off the bat with a clip from the Ramsey County board meeting where the Ramsey County county manager started off his remarks to the county board talking about how this year the process for reviewing and putting together their proposal for property taxes is going to be different than in past years, that one of the focuses of this year's property tax process is thinking in the back of their mind, how is this going to impact racial equity? Now, for a lot of you out there, you may say, well, having the word property taxes and racial equity in the same sentence seems kind of like an oxymoron. I mean, how can that even be possible? But let's hear his comments, and this is from August 6th.
Racial equity work must move alongside focused community engagement efforts that ensure that all corners of all communities are engaged in the important work of our organization. This proposed budget, for the first time, establishes a dedicated funding source for community engagement as we place its importance alongside all other technical components of program design and policy delivery. Authentic, inclusive community engagement will be central to all the work that we do with the community that we are here to serve. Racial equity and community engagement work is central to all areas of this organization, and you'll hear that in the budget days ahead, with specific mention on the strategic team's budget day.
Now this idea of having community outreach, while certainly I support that, I hope their community outreach isn't the same type of community outreach that they've been engaging in when it comes to the Rushline BRT, where they have a lot of meetings, but nobody's really actually writing down the comments. So, Mr. Copeland, what are your thoughts on this whole idea of saying that we're going to go out into the community, we're going to get engagement of the community, and somehow that's going to tie in racial equity? And given that we are already in August and they have to have their budgets done by November, do we have enough time for public engagement?
Well, there's always time for public engagement, but along the lines of what Mr. Ryan O'Connor, the county manager, was saying, that this is somehow the first time we've ever done that. You know, I remember long ago, in fact, I remember meeting the man who's now your husband at a Ramsey County similar engagement session back in the 90s dealing with social services and various other issues that the county was trying to reprogram, if you will. And, you know, we heard the same talk. The reality is, at the end of the day, every administrator wants to come in and appear to be doing something new and different, when in fact, what he's doing is not new, because the bottom line is that what he's proposing is $11 million in new costs right on the top line, and he's wanting to hire himself 12 and a half new staffers. He's looking at having 130 people in the county manager's office. This is ridiculous. When nothing changes, nothing changes.
That's right. And we covered on a previous news report a few weeks back on how the Ramsey County Commissioners gave themselves all a big fat pay raise, and that had nothing to do with racial equity. Well, let's continue with our next clip as they start to talk about some of the statistics that go into the technical aspects of generating property tax levies.
Page 4 shows our median value of residential properties. Residential properties are up 9%, commercial industrial 5%, and apartments are up 7%. Next is a 3-year comparison of the estimated market value. And you can see that values rose 6.8% in 2018 and 6.6% in 2019. Pretty uniform. The next section shows total value of new construction. And this is broken down by non-TIF, which is the value of construction that is captured in our tax base, and TIF, the tax increment finance part. You'll see that non-TIF new construction is up 9% in 2019 from 18. TIF construction is down 48%. We had, what's interesting here is that big drop, but it's really because in 2017 there was approximately 23 different TIF projects, and in 2019.
Looking at these particular statistics, keep in mind that the values of the properties that they're speaking about are actually determined by the Ramsey County assessor. They're not determined by some other outside party, some third party that's unrelated to the county. It is the county themselves that determine these values. So do we think that these are valid numbers? Well, certainly they might have the potential for being valid, but as they also reported at this same meeting, the number of property tax appeals of property taxpayers has gone up. That there's a record number of property taxpayers out there who believe that the county's valuation of their property is a little out of whack. So now, did you notice, Mr. Copeland, how one of the housing types of property that had the biggest increase in market value is that of apartments?
Yes, indeed. And that's been kind of a trend lately because the economy has been producing a lot of jobs. And whenever a community has a low unemployment rate, people want to move into that community and get a job. And that's where we're at right now. Our economy in Ramsey County is doing better than it's done in a long, long time. In fact, the overall, if you want to believe these numbers, and we have no other numbers at this point, they're several $1 billion over and above the 2008 valuations. And that's the beginning of the last, we'll call it a depression, because frankly, there were a lot of people that were hurt by that. So, I think though when we're talking about racial equity with property tax, that's very difficult, because our properties are evaluated for what they're worth, where they sit in the neighborhoods that they're in the cities they're in, and there's no color distinction. Nobody asks you if your home is from Somalia, because it's not. It's from St. Paul, or it's in Maplewood, or it's in
right.
Shoreview.
And I think one of the other factors that I gleaned from this as I was listening to this meeting, that it appears that in those neighborhoods where the housing has been more affordable, because that particular single-family home has a lower value to it, that there's actually this push at the county to put a higher value, market value on that property. And so unfortunately, those people who have the housing, the single family housing that I'm talking about now, that is in that range that is most affordable, they are the ones that are getting hardest hit with the property taxes because they're seeing the greatest increase, supposed increase in the market value of their housing. Now, the county says that in part is because, there's such a demand for housing in that sector of the market. However, you also have to, qualify in order to buy a house, and it isn't always that you're going to be able to afford more, a higher value for that same house. So I don't know if I necessarily buy their argument, because people who have only a certain amount of income can only qualify for a certain value of a home. They're not going to overbid on that home because they don't have the extra money to do that.
Yeah, honestly, I think if the county wants to help people of lower income obtain housing, then they ought to put their energies into helping people get good jobs, and then go through the financing process, clean up credit issues and that type of thing, and get them set to buy a piece of property, when they get that job and that down payment, or help them even with a down payment. I mean, I used to talk about the Menards down payment. Instead of spending $300,000 to rehab a house, as the former mayor in St. Paul used to do, we could give somebody a $10,000 down payment that could be forgivable over a period of time to get them into a house and let them go to Menards and build that house back to where it needs to be over time.
And that creates stability as well in the housing market and in the neighborhoods of St. Paul.
And it eliminates the gentrification complaint, because that's what we hear. I mean, I live off of Payne Avenue, as you know, Diana, and we hear this all the time that, wow, if we have all these people coming to the neighborhood, the community's going to change. There's not going to be any room for poor people. Okay, well, you're talking, I'm a poor guy right here talking, okay? And a lot of people in my neighborhood, there's no rich people hiding out on Cook Avenue, all right? But there's people that rent, and there's people that buy. And the difference between the two is usually steady employment and maybe a little older profile with the buyers, obviously. But a lot of renters now are looking at the buy situation because they're paying these huge rents. And frankly, mortgage rates are going down. And so when you got cheaper money and you got an incentive to look, because your landlord maybe is raising the price because they can in a free market, naturally there's going to be more people looking at those houses. And frankly, there seem to be fewer houses available this year than other years. And in my particular neighborhood, I do notice, based on the reports that the newspapers publish about sales, that indeed prices are going up. There's still bargains out there. There's still bargains for people that want to acquire a home that's foreclosed. Foreclosures are still happening, that's for sure. But if we work with the market as it is, because frankly, I don't know how you can work against the market. I mean, Ramsey County only has the money that they take from taxpayers. So, Ramsey County can't buy anybody a house, and St. Paul can't either. So,
and I think one thing that you brought up is that in many cases it's becoming a better economic value to purchase than it is to be in an apartment. However, there are a lot of factors that work against a person from getting into that home, especially if they are a younger person and they've got that high college student loan debt ratio to their income. That's going to be a huge factor that's going to really impact their ability. But now in our next clip, we've got some more statistics, so let's take a look at that.
On page 5, we're comparing the 2019 assessment with the 2007 high point before the recession. You can see that all major property types have fully recovered. A big contributor to this is the apartment market, which is up $4 billion, an assessed value change above that 2007 high point. So apartments, 2/3 of the increase in the recovery is due to just the apartment value alone. So that's pretty significant. Last year when I presented this, residential was 916 million that had yet to recover. The residential market is now 1.84 billion above the 2007 high point. If you stratify the residential 1.84 billion by planning districts and municipality, you really get a much different, clearer picture of which areas have recovered. And this was done on page 6.
I find it interesting, he says that all sectors have recovered from the Depression. Okay, well that's great, good and dandy, except that next he'll show us a chart which shows that all properties in all sectors have not recovered. So we have kind of a conflict between the statistics there. But what I found ironic in that last slide is that apartments, which of course is the big thing that Ramsey County and so many of the suburbs, including Maplewood, are really pushing now to build apartment complexes and voucher apartment complexes, is that these apartment complexes, they're the properties that are generating the most increases in property taxes. So you see the entities that collect the property taxes, they have a great incentive to push developers into building apartments, rather than, as you indicated, focusing on what can we do to keep our housing stock of single-family homes up to date by giving out smaller loans where people can do fixer-uppers. It's amazing when you start looking at these statistics.
Yeah, I mean, you can do great things if you have tons of cash. I mean, and I'm talking about government incentives to builders, developers, and the like. But we don't have tons of cash unless we raise taxes. And frankly, just because the economy's doing better doesn't mean we have to take all the gains that people have made away from them. And additionally, just because certain properties on the lowest end, and that being, properties in my neighborhood, Payne Phelan, or on the north end, or properties in Frogtown, those are the ones that are slated to have these large dollar increases in taxes because they've had a larger percentage in gain, but they started off at a very small base, and frankly, there is a large market for entry into housing. Despite what we may be told by some real estate experts out there, those houses are being snatched up. And they're being snatched up by people from out of town a lot of times who want to rent them out, get on that rental gravy train, if you will. That's what they think of it as, or the people that are selling them that idea. And then there's the real people that we want to bring into the neighborhood that may be living there in rental housing. We want to keep them in the neighborhood. We want to get them into a house. And we want to stabilize our neighborhoods with people that already live there. And it seems like we're always bringing people in from some other city to live in some new property developed by the Habitat for Humanity or whatever. Why do we do that? Why don't we take people that are already renting in our community that want to live there, are living there, and support them and get them ready to transition into a home that they can own when they have a good job and they've got some money for a down payment to match with perhaps a public assist on that over time, and to stabilize these neighborhoods. Because the biggest problem I see in the lower income areas, and I've lived there for, almost 28 years on the east side of St. Paul, below Maryland, people tell me, oh, that's a tough neighborhood there, Greg. Well, you know what? It's just a neighborhood that's seen a lot of change because our economy has a lot of ups and downs, and it clearly reflects that.
And I would imagine that the folks of that particular district would love to have good paying, sustainable jobs close to home.
Amen.
Well, now
Amen.
Let's take a look at that next slide where they start talking about the different areas of St. Paul and the recovery rates.
So if you stratify that 1.84 billion residential recovery, can really take a look at it by municipality and planning districts. You can see in the red areas, North End, Payne Phelan, Dayton's Bluff need double-digit increases to fully recover from that 2007 high point. Many of these areas in red are located in areas of concentrated poverty with over 50% people of color. Many of these areas in red have seen double-digit increases in value for a number of years. These are the areas that saw values go down the most during the recession and are increasing the most now, but they still have not caught up. Reasons for these increases is just recovery from the recession, the demand for good housing stock. St. Paul is one of the few major cities in the metro with median values under 200,000, so more people can afford to buy homes in St. Paul. Many of these property owners are actually relieved to see their values come back. gaining equity in their property. It's their nest egg for retirement. But they're very, very concerned about the increase in taxes. Looking at current sales, I do anticipate that these areas in red will increase next year as well, and maybe fully recover from that 2007 high point. So while the increases in property value is great, it's a great opportunity for property owners from the standpoint of equity, it comes with the stress of property tax increases.
So, Mr. Copeland, your neighborhood has not fully recovered, even though just the slide before, all the areas have fully recovered. Now, we noticed that that area of Maplewood is also not fully recovered, but not to the same extent as the east side of St. Paul. The whole area of Maplewood was a light gray color, which is -5 to 5%. So basically, Maplewood is hovering around an average of 0. And so they're right on the edge of recovery, but not quite there. But I will tell you that when you listen to the Maplewood City Council, they are telling you that things are going gangbusters in Maplewood, and that it's way over and above recovery. So you see how again, statistics can come from all different meetings as to being able to validate what you hear in somebody else's meeting.
The tellers of these wild tales about everything's happening, have these folks been to the Maplewood Mall? Sears is, a ghost town. Macy's, today I heard, took a real big hit because their earnings went way below where they were supposed to be. We're lucky to keep the thing going over there. So, I hear about all these wonderful things that are happening, and it's always wonderful when people are spending money to improve their property because they see some newer income coming in or some value increases, things are a little better for them. But, when the county manager says there's the stress of more taxes, well, who's creating the stress? Ramsey County.
And of course, what we hear when we listen to the Ramsey County discussions on this, or even at the municipal levels, is that they all then blame the state legislature. You know that, right? And of course, who are their buddies? The county commissioners, who are their buddies? Well, but they're legislators at the state capitol. Well, they could all just get together, and talk about this and try to figure something out rather than just sitting and pointing fingers at each other. But let's go and take a look at our next clip.
Those areas that are seeing the largest increases: Thomasdale, Frogtown, Dayton's Bluff, Payne Phelan, North End, West 7th, Maplewood, Mounds View, North St. Paul, and Spring Lake Park are all those areas that we're seeing higher increases in market value. So those are areas that are likely to then see much larger increases in property taxes, primarily due to the tax shifts. I want you to remember these areas as we go forward to the chart on planning districts, because essentially what we're going to be looking at here is that these are also the areas that have the lowest median value. So the largest increases typically are happening in those areas where we have the lowest median values, and that has implications.
Guess what those implications are? Well, it affects most greatly those folks who are least likely to afford it. I mean, that's what we're talking about, because all of those areas that he identified are the regions where there is that section of housing that folks who don't have a big income coming in every year, where they can actually find a house to purchase. And yet, what is the county doing now? Of course, he blames it on the tax shift, but of course that's pointing a finger at the legislature, but who in the end sent their county assessors out and about in the neighborhoods to identify how much each property should go up in value. I'll give you an example. Now, I happen to have, I own a small, very modest home in Maplewood. And it was, during the recession, it actually went down to about $97,000 in value. Well, it crept up to like 117, 119,000, right? This last year, it went from $119,000 in market value to roughly about 143,000. And of course, there have been no improvements. There's been nothing done. And not only that, I don't even have a designated city road servicing my property. I have to drive through somebody else's driveway to get to my house. So I called up the county assessor and I said, hey, how can you justify this? He says, well, I'm going to have to come out and take a look. Well, I pointed out all the shortcomings of this little farmhouse, and in the end he decided, well, he could knock it down to like about 121,000 or something like that. Well, it goes to show you how arbitrary it is, because he asked me, well, what would you like to see it be? Well, okay, that's one way to measure what that property value should be. What would I like to see it be? I told him I'd like to see it be the same thing it was last year. So he decided, well, we're going to put at least $5,000 more on it, and we're going to be good with that. So you see, it's arbitrary. These market values are arbitrary.
Well, and I have to totally agree with you on that point. And here's why. You know, they do these assessments based in part on, you know, some contact in the neighborhoods. And by the way, when the county manager, Mr. O'Connor, keeps talking about planning districts, as sort of this antiseptic or sterile term that he's using, this kind of Soviet planning district, those are neighborhoods. We call those our neighborhoods in St. Paul, Mr. O'Connor. And I hope that when you're here a little longer, and I don't know where you live, maybe you live in a planning district. I live in a neighborhood. And my neighbors live in neighborhoods, and the people in Dayton's Bluff, they live in a neighborhood called Dayton's Bluff. So there you go. But in any event, when the county comes out to take a look at somebody's property who's questioning the assessment, they want to take the big tour through your property and see all the wonderful things that you've done, which I find rather ironic because, you know, when you're appealing your value, you get more investigation into your property. You know, they're doing all this stuff. They got their little magnifying glass out. They're running around the house. Whereas, you know, if you don't raise any question, well, they've done it on a computer. They sent you the notice, and if you don't say anything, that's what you pay. So, you know,
Well, and in my
it's very
case-
arbitrary because
Yes.
it's subjective in the sense that unless they get in your house, they're not going to change it. They'll tell you if they don't get in your house. Well, wait a minute. You evaluated my building, my property, my lot and everything without ever getting in the house. So now why do you need to get in the house? It's just amazing.
And that's exactly correct, and that was what I was told as well, that there would not be any adjustment unless he was able to go into the property and look around. He then asked me if he could take pictures. I said, no, you can't take pictures. And he said, that's okay, we don't need to take pictures. I said, okay, good, because I don't want you taking pictures. But when he went in there, you know, it wasn't like a typical appraisal where they go and they look at, you know, how many bathrooms you have, and then they do comparables, and then they look and see if you have, you know, exactly what the, you know, the lay of the land, how many rooms. He basically just sort of walked through the kitchen, through the living room, through the one bedroom, the bathroom, saw that there was a basement that basically is a dirt basement, and that there's a little peak of an attic that apparently wasn't worth his time to walk up the little creaky stairs to get up there. Because after all, it is a little old farmhouse.
So Diana, you don't have marble floors.
I don't have marble
Oh,
floors.
my
That's
gosh.
exactly right. So it was exactly as I told him. A little old farmhouse, nothing more, nothing less. And that's why I believe it is an arbitrary process.
Absolutely.
It is not like having an appraisal done. So let's continue with our next clip as they continue.
A new piece of the discussion is we want to talk about affordable housing. We want to talk about racial equity and the implications of what we're seeing in terms of these value changes as part of the process. There's a lot going on in this chart. On the left-hand side, what we're looking at is the HUD categories for what constitutes income for low income at 80% AMI, very low income, extremely low income. And so taking a look at those household income levels, in the next column over, we project what is that estimated maximum home that they could afford based on that income. So in the case of an extremely low-income family at $30,000, the maximum affordable house they could have would be about the $83,500. When you're at low income with an income of $75,500, a maximum affordable house of $234,500. In the next column, we start looking at, so in Ramsey County, how many of these homes do we have that would these families would be able to afford? And when you take a look at the extremely low income, where they can afford a home of $83,500, we have supply of $1,685. And going off to the far right-hand side is where we're taking a look, based on census data, how many households do we have in that income range? And in that extremely low income range or below, we have 51,325 households in Ramsey County. So we're looking at, the focus in recent discussions has talked a lot about apartments and affordable housing as it relates to apartments, but here we're looking at what's happening with owner-occupied housing and the availability of owner-occupied housing in the ranges that are needed. And you can see that this reinforces the gap that we're already aware of, but I don't know that we've necessarily looked at the numbers as it relates to owner-occupied housing in the past to emphasize just what that looks like.
Now, I'm really glad that they put these statistics together, but I can see where these statistics help to support their sales pitch as to why they need to build and construct more apartments, because we have priced all the houses that people can afford, so therefore we need to house them somehow, so now we have to build them apartments. Well, the entity that created this problem is the entity that gave them the increased market value, in my mind. And here's the other point that I'd like to make, is that those homes that are the affordable homes that folks would look to buy that can afford them, those properties do not generate as much property tax revenue as all those apartments that the county and cities like Maplewood want to construct. So again, it goes to that motivation as to what is it that they want to encourage developers to build more of. Not single-family homes, but apartment buildings that are income generators for the county and for the municipalities.
Yeah, I think it comes down to a simple question. Do you want to help people who have families that need a home, as in a single-family home, with a backyard for the kids to play in, that old traditional American dream house, It doesn't have to be fancy, it doesn't have to be brand new. When my wife and I got our little place there on Cook Avenue, we got to go to Menards too, and the place had been vacant a long time, and the market was down, and we, I think, got a good price. We had a contract for deed, on and on it goes. But the point is that if you're going to subsidize apartments, guess what you're going to get? Developers showing up to take the subsidy to build apartments. If you're not spending any money to help families get into a single-family home, you're going to have no families going into single-family homes. And I would add that in St. Paul, when Mr. Chris Coleman was the mayor, he took down more houses that could have been turned into those Menards houses I was talking about to deal with this crisis in housing that is so often written about in the media. And now he's the head of the Twin Cities Habitat for Humanity, and he's building these new houses over on Maryland in a swamp, 11 houses, I think it is, and they're spending like $11 million. I mean, honest to God, that is not affordable to the taxpayer. It's not affordable to the state of Minnesota or the federal government or to the families. And when they buy those houses, quote unquote, they're not getting a full possession there. That's a, you know, the habitat, you know, it's a tiered deal. It's, you know, based on what you put in. And I mean, it's not like you're buying a home and it's yours until the day that you decide to sell it.
And here's something else that I think that's very important to talk about, is that we also hear this urban legend, this myth, that millennials do not want to own homes, that they prefer living in apartments, and that's what they want, and that's what the market is for the millennials. However, if you go out and really actually talk to a good cross-section of millennials, you'll find that that urban legend, that urban myth is false. Because if they had the financial wherewithal, that they had a good paying, sustainable job that created the income they needed, or that they didn't have that student debt that they have, they would love to buy a house. And that they don't necessarily want to live in an apartment, but that's what they are stuck with. And that when they settle down and they have kids of their own, they're not looking to stay in that apartment setting. Absolutely. They're saying, well, you know, boy, maybe we need to have a little bit more space for the kids, have a yard. And again, you know, I look at my own two sons, which are millennials, and they, you know, they came about this in a different way of how they looked at things, and that when they went to college, they went to the Century College first to get a lot of their credits done out of the way, and then went to college to finish up their degrees. They didn't take on a lot of student loan debt. They saved their money for a down payment, and they are both in houses. And it wasn't because I said, hey, boys, you should buy houses. One is in St. Paul, one is in Maplewood. But they decided all on their own because they knew that's what they wanted. They lived in apartments for a time, and they knew that that was not the life for them. So this urban legend, this urban myth that the millennials are changing the paradigm and we have to have apartments for all of them, that is not necessarily true. Maybe they need housing, obviously, but if they have that kind of student debt or they don't have jobs, well, that apartment life is where they're living, but that's not their first choice.
Yeah, and when we're talking about housing, we often forget two other big components when we're talking about the urban situation. We're talking about parents that want what? The best quality schools that they can get for their children, whether it's a fully public school or a charter school, which of course is a version of a public school, or if it's a private religious-based institution or some other private school. People are looking for education for their children that is top quality. That's very important in this dynamic. And then the other issue is crime. When we talk about stable neighborhoods, we're talking about those good schools, affordable housing, with a mix. It's not all going to be ownership. There's going to be some rental in there, of course, because it's a transitional thing. I mean, I don't know too many people that started out owning their house.
No.
I mean, there's a few entrepreneurial types that got lucky and did something like that. But, you know, I knew people that rented. We all did. And we've, you know, this is part of your process here. And I don't think any of that's new. It hasn't changed. But crime will undercut the progress in a neighborhood. And crime breeds where there's instability. Crime breeds where there is an attitude of, oh, I'm giving up, I'm leaving.
Right,
I'm going
and a lack
else.
of jobs,
And that ties it all together because, as we talked about earlier, Diana, without the good jobs coming in your community, you're not even going to get people trying to rent homes.
Right.
Period.
Now, with our next clip, it is the county manager's plea to the community of giving comments. Now, at this point, I want you to ask yourself, do you really think that your comments are going to make any difference? Because the time for appealing your property tax valuation is gone. They already have their idea about what they want to budget for. The county commissioners already have their raises. They already got their big plans. So do you think at this point, mid-August, that comments and public engagement is truly actually going to make a difference? But let's give him an opportunity to give his best shot at giving a plea to the public to get your input.
And I want to push everyone watching today, please share your thoughts directly with your elected officials by providing public testimony using the link listed at the bottom of this slide, or contacting the Finance Department directly via the information provided on the next slide. This is your chance to be heard. This is your community. This is your budget. Please speak up, share your support, raise concerns, and pose questions.
Share your concerns, pose questions, but it doesn't mean that they'll ever take action on anything that you have to say. Now, switching over to the report from the city of St. Paul. Now, they had their meeting on August 7th, where they went through some of the same statistics, but then they also focused them more specifically on St. Paul. So let's get started with our first clip from that meeting.
So similar to prior years, one of the factors we will be dealing with this year again is tax shifts. And it's one of those concepts that's very difficult to explain. Essentially what's happening is as properties increase in value, if some properties are increasing at a greater rate than others, we have a shift in taxes that takes place from those that have lesser increases or decreases to those that have greater increases. And it appears on those property tax statements as an increase to each of those governmental agencies, but it's really the result of the structural shifts, the changes in the market values, and the shifts that are occurring because of that proportionate share of the pie. Essentially what's happening, those properties that have larger increases in value have a greater share of the overall pie or the burden for property taxes, and so consequently we see a shift then in taxes to those properties that have the larger increases in value.
So for instance, if you were to take my little farmhouse that went from that 119,000 to that 143,000 or whatever it was, you know, that's like a 20% or 25% increase in the market value. So that means that I would get to pay my proportional share of that increase. Wow, that means that way I'm going to be paying a whole lot more taxes.
In fact, if you look at the chart, and that was Chris Samuel, he's the Ramsey County auditor that was speaking there, presenting to the St. Paul City Council. He presented a chart. If you go to the St. Paul City Council, you could actually look this all up yourself, but we've done that for you, as is always the case with Diana's program. We bring you the news. And here it is. If you have commercial property, your taxable value over the last year, this is for the market as a whole, the whole city, 1.3% increase. If you're living in a home, a residential piece of property, 8.3%. So the shift is two houses. People who own homes are going to pay more of the tax bill in St. Paul. Apartment owners, they're getting an 8.3% taxable market value increase this year. So again, they're going to be paying more of the taxes. What does that tell you about rents? Rents are going to probably be going up, folks.
Right, because those landlords, they're not just going to say, well, I guess I'm going to be, just
a charity.
It's just going to come off my bottom line. No, they pass it on to their tenants. And that's where when they want to talk about equity and racial equity and financial equity, I mean, these policies, they impact renters just as much as they affect homeowners, because renters end up being the ones having to pay those extra increases because it then is transferred to them. And that's just the way it works. Now let's take a look at our next clip.
This year, market values are up as we continue to see strong growth, 6.4% increase in market values overall, and we're now almost $3.6 billion above where we were at in the 2008 peak. So we fully recovered from the recession, and we are above that. in terms of the market values. Now, that is not to say that market values have recovered uniformly. And there are still areas, including those areas where we are seeing the largest increases in value this year, that are still at a point where they're recovering from where they had been in the recession.
See, now this report that he's giving is to the St. Paul City Council. So when he is mixing the apples of Ramsey County in general, saying that they have recovered from the Depression, he is mixing it with the oranges of St. Paul, where we saw that map previously that showed that a great portion of St. Paul, particularly there on the east side, that, as they said, would have to take double-digit increases in order to get to that recovery level. So you see, by giving his presentation like this, it doesn't necessarily give the accurate information to the St. Paul City Council members that they need to have in order to properly create policy for St. Paul residents. And that, to my mind, is an issue, because I don't think that these St. Paul City Council members then are asking him to then differentiate, well, let's just talk about St. Paul. We don't care about Ramsey County in general. We want to know specifically just about St. Paul, because that is who we have authority over to create public policy.
Right, and if you look at some of the neighborhoods that are in the center of that chart in the red that we saw earlier in the show, those are the areas that are really going to take some very large increases, even without a change in the tax levy. And tomorrow, Mayor Carter will be giving his budget address, Diana, and I would be shocked, and I would be happily surprised and shocked if he comes up with a budget that has no increase, but I don't think that's going to happen. I can't remember the last time since Norm Coleman was mayor, in fact, and that was a long time ago now, that we had a zero increase. So in any event, let's look at a couple of neighborhoods. Dayton's Bluff, 14.7% change over the last year.
Oh, that's those double digits that they said that they had to come up with to make it look like they were in recovery.
Yeah,
but again, that's according to the Ramsey County assessor, correct?
Right, that's correct. And
Okay.
these are based on the median estimated home market values. We're talking about 11.8 in Payne Phelan. We're talking 13.6 in the north end. And then Thomas Dale, otherwise affectionately known as Frogtown, 18.6. And that was the headline in the paper the other day, in the Pioneer Press. We'll just hold it up here a second if you didn't see it over the weekend. Frogtown property taxes soar. They're talking about a $300 minimum increase if there is no tax increase in St. Paul generally. And in some of the other neighborhoods, we're talking about $140 in Payne Phelan. We're talking about $200 plus on the north end easily. So that's what happened. So when people are talking about recovery, that's a perspective kind of real estate and the market, and it's great if you're in great shape financially.
And the politicians sitting around the table who really don't live in those neighborhoods and really don't have any real relationship with understanding even what it's like to live in that neighborhood.
Yeah, those of us that live there don't think in terms of recovery. We think in terms of, oh, damn it, our taxes are going up again, and the road still has the same potholes, you know, or we're getting that garbage thing thrown at us, and that's costing us a fortune more already. That's double what we used to have for costs. Then we have a property tax added for the garbage in addition to the high cost of the can. I mean, you know, there's just no end to more cost. So recovery is a word that we don't understand in the poor neighborhoods of St. Paul. And, you know, there's people who are living in Payne Phelan who are not quote unquote poor, who are retired, who have, you know, paid for their home. They're trying to keep their home. They want to stay in their home.
Right, and they still have certainly a limited income
Very
because
definitely.
they, you know, I mean, they're retired.
Exactly.
And certainly there's, you know, maybe the stock market's doing a little better now lately.
Well, not today.
But not today, yeah, not today. Maybe tomorrow, though, again. But you see, it's up and down. It's not necessarily something you can count on. And I think that people would feel that there was recovery if they knew that there were more good-paying, sustainable jobs within their neighborhood or the neighborhood right next door to their neighborhood, that they didn't have to travel all the way over to Hopkins to go find a good-paying, sustainable job.
Bingo, exactly right.
Yes.
And you know, that's what people need in our communities, and that's where our focus should be, is on what economic opportunities can the government create to build a recovery in areas where there hasn't been a recovery. Okay? I mean, you know, you don't need to spend a lot of money in the Highland Park area. I mean, of course, I don't live there, I'll admit it, but I think those folks over there are doing, by and large, a whole lot better. I mean, you know, they see changes between chains of stores. When a chain store goes out in my neighborhood, we get an empty building and maybe some industrial use becomes made of the building. Maybe they knock the building down, or on a rare occasion, maybe there's a reuse of a similar nature by an
Or
entrepreneur.
unfortunately, it stays vacant for a
Well,
while.
and on Payne Avenue, that's exactly what happened.
Right. So let's continue with our next clip.
You can see that in the case of industrial property, not growing as much, commercial basically flat, continued strong residential growth, apartment growth not as strong as we have been seeing, but still strong. And I will call out the difference there between the estimated market value and the taxable market value for residential property, and that's because of the loss of the exclusion. So the main difference there between the estimated market value and taxable market value is that homestead exclusion, and that's why we're seeing a larger increase for taxing purposes for those properties. But the bottom line, estimated market value, the value assigned by the county assessor, is a 6.4% increase for the city of St. Paul. The taxable market value is at 6.9% after we take into account the legislative formulas as to what properties are taxed and how. And the tax base then is actually increasing by 6.2%.
Now, certainly the legislative formulas do have an impact on some of the computations for the property taxes, but we heard how commercial properties are basically flat in the property tax increases in the market value that they have. Well, we also have heard a lot about if they're, you know, in the housing market, because there's such competition for these very affordable homes, that has resulted in that market value going up. Well, okay, so let's say we're going to give them credit for that theory, and according to that logic then is that if there was a lot of competition for these commercial industrial properties, they too would go up in market value and generate more property taxes, correct?
Correct.
And if there was more competition for them, that would mean that the economy was going stronger, because there must be more jobs and more being produced on the east side. So maybe they could get going on figuring out how to bring that about as the elected officials of St. Paul.
Well, and frankly, without jobs, how do you have an economy? I mean, you know, we talk about retired people. Well, they, of course, had a job. Now they're not employed, or they're seeking, well, I'm going to be working out at the fair, Diane. I want you to know. Come out and see me at Northern Hardware. A little commercial there. Anyway, but seriously, you know, people need steady employment. They need this 2 and 3 job thing. You know, that works for a while, but when you're trying to juggle childcare, when you're trying to juggle different people's schedules in the family, how do you accomplish that and keep your sanity?
And you're trying to use the buses.
Oh, hey.
The bus schedule. Oh, come on now. Let's be serious. Now, we promised you that we were going to jump to part of a city council meeting where the police chief Axtell was talking to the St. Paul City Council about his department and what they've been doing and their plans for the future, and kind of, you know, some of the things that he'd like to change, and increases to his budget too, of course. But while he was there, there was an outburst from the audience, and so let's go to clip number 39 as we hear the outburst, and then
You guys still have crimes on the east side, Maryland Avenue, Payne Avenue, there's drug dealers, fights, downtown St. Paul, you got your transits not doing nothing. What are you guys doing? Where's the money? Where are you guys spending the money on?
I sense your frustration, and I'm sorry for your frustrations, and I'll give you my card after the meeting, and
You know
we'll
who I am.
we'll
My name is
connect.
Howard Jackson.
I do, Mr. Jackson. Thank you very much.
Tim Walsh promoted Melissa Horton, Gunn. So I want all you guys to know this.
We hear you, although,
Public human corruption is going on.
right,
you, sir.
and
This
this,
department. Tim Walsh who promoted Melissa Horton, who's Gunderson. I just want to speak. My name is Howard Jackson.
I'm sorry, but this is not the venue for that, and there are venues for that we are convening in the
St.
future.
Paul Police Department hasn't done nothing. They haven't even stopped or slowed down crimes. Tell me to step down. I don't think he's the real leader for St. Paul.
Thank you,
That's
sir.
all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
Thank you.
Hopefully I hear from you, Still.
Thank you.
You haven't responded back to me yet.
Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Okay.
He talked about the crime in the Payne-Phelan neighborhood. Mr. Copeland,
Well-
I think that you talked about that previously, earlier in our program as well, and the importance of keeping crime down in the neighborhoods for the stability of a neighborhood. Now, with the last few seconds we have, let's go to clip number 40 as we hear from the police chief.
Sometimes policy has unintended consequences, like the racial profiling and different things like that. And I'm just curious, what is the department doing proactively to prevent that sort of thing, but also ensure that the law is enforced, because we do have a lot of distracted driving.
Yeah, thank you, Councilmember Tao. So we have ongoing conversations over the last 3 years about the impact of policing in this community, which is why I drew back the curtains of 15 years worth of traffic stop data, knowing that the numbers were ugly, if you will, showing that there's disproportionate rates of traffic stops and citations that go to our communities of color in this city, as they do in any other city throughout the country. Each year now, we implemented a plan where our officers review their individual data with their supervisors on their employee evaluations, to have an honest conversation about, here's our numbers, and making sure that we all understand that implicit bias is a human condition. Every human being possesses implicit bias, but we want to make sure that implicit bias never plays a role in how we police our community. And you can't really do that unless you acknowledge every human being possesses a level of implicit bias. So we worked hard. Every year, our officers go through implicit bias training, an annual commitment. We used to do it after something bad happened. We don't wait for something bad to happen. We do it proactively each and every year. But I can also tell you that 33% of the landmass in the city of St. Paul are areas of concentrated poverty with over 50% diverse members. That's a large percentage of our city. And I can also tell you, when you lay the shots fired, the people injured by gunfire, the crimes that are occurring in our city, predominantly a high portion and percentage of that is in our areas of high levels of concentrated poverty. Is that to say people who have less resources commit higher crimes? Absolutely not. But we have to study what really leads to crime. Crime, I believe, is a symptom of disproportionate gaps in our healthcare system, our school system, our finances, our housing, and I could go on and on and on and on.
He gets to the point where he says that not having jobs has an impact on our neighborhoods. Thank you, Mr. Copeland, for being here.
Hey, I love it.